All right, this is quite the stack of stuff you've sent for our deep dive today.
Yeah.
Seems like you're really fascinated by how we learn, how we achieve things, um, even how we figure out what all these things we read really mean.
Yeah, it's a pretty wide range of stuff too, Like we've got some Carol Dweck on mindsets, some tips on how to really get the most out of reading something difficult, even a little bit of poetry analysis with John Donne's Death Be Not Proud.
So I'm guessing you want to know how to understand all this without having to spend hours and hours on it?
Exactly. We want to break it down and find those really key moments that make it all click.
I like it. Let's start with Carol Dweck. Everyone's talking about growth mindset these days, but what about her work really jumped out at you?
Well, one of the things I thought was super interesting was how much our mindset really affects what we do. It's not just some feel-good thing.
Yeah.
She found that people who have a fixed mindset, those who think you can't really change how smart you are or how good you are at things, those people actually avoid challenges.
Yeah.
They rather just not risk looking dumb than try to learn something new.
I can definitely see that. I've totally felt that way myself. But what's crazy is that her research showed that fear of failure actually makes it more likely that you will fail.
Right. Think about the seventh graders in her study. The ones who thought they couldn't get any smarter actually saw their math grades get worse.
Well,
It's like they were so scared of making mistakes that they just stopped trying.
yeah.
But the kids who had a growth mindset, who thought they could get better if they worked hard, those kids actually got better over time.
That's pretty incredible. It really shows how much believing in yourself can help, even when things are hard. But does this mindset stuff really matter outside of school?
Oh, definitely. Dweck found that a growth mindset can change all kinds of things, like relationships, how you handle disagreements, even how you deal with prejudice. There was this one study where they taught a growth mindset to teenagers who were really aggressive. And you know what? They actually started acting less aggressively, and they were even more likely to reach out to the people who'd been excluding them.
That's amazing. So it's not just about getting good grades. A growth mindset can actually help us create a kinder and more understanding world.
Exactly. It's about seeing the potential for change in yourself and in other people. And that potential comes from working hard, not giving up, and being okay with not knowing something yet.
Okay, so mindset is clearly important. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about those critical reading strategies you mentioned. How can we train ourselves to be better readers and really understand what we read?
Well, a lot of people think reading is just a passive thing. You just sit there and absorb the words. But it's not. It's about actively engaging with what you're reading.
Yeah.
Asking questions, making connections, even disagreeing with the author.
That makes sense. I know I often just skim things, especially if I'm tired or busy. But I guess that's not the best way to really learn and remember what I'm reading.
Right. One of the simplest but most effective things you can do is annotate. Don't be afraid to mark up your text. Highlight important phrases, write down questions in the margins, even draw little diagrams if that helps you.
So it's kind of like having a conversation with the author, right? You're not just listening, you're responding and adding your own thoughts.
Exactly. And that's where things like paraphrasing, summarizing, and outlining come in. They make you put the information into your own words, which is a much better way to learn than just reading it passively.
It reminds me of something I used to do in school. I would try to explain what I was reading to an imaginary friend.
Ah,
It really forced me to think it through and make sure I actually understood it.
that's a great idea. Teaching someone else is one of the best ways to really understand something yourself.
So we've got annotating, we've got putting things in our own words. What else should we do to become critical readers?
Context is super important. Don't just read the words on the page. Think about who wrote them, when, and why. Understanding the historical, cultural, and social context can completely change how you understand something.
I get that. I recently read a novel from the 1800s, and some of the words and phrases really tripped me up. I had to do some research on the historical context to figure out what they actually meant back then.
Exactly. And it's not just about historical context. Think about the author's background, their beliefs, their reasons for writing. All of that can influence how they present information and what arguments they make.
So we're not just passively taking in words, we're actively thinking about the text, the context, and the author's message. It's almost like we're detectives, trying to piece together clues.
I like that analogy. And like any good detective, we need to be aware of the author's techniques. They use all sorts of things to try to persuade us: figurative language, emotional appeals, even the way they structure their arguments.
So we need to be smart readers, able to recognize those techniques and think critically about them. We can't just believe everything we read.
Right. We need to be able to spot those moments where the author is trying to subtly push us in a certain direction. And that's where practice comes in. The more you read critically, the better you'll get at noticing those subtle cues.
Okay, so we've talked about mindset and we've talked about critical reading strategies. Now, how do we actually use these strategies? So let's get specific.
Okay. You actually sent a perfect example, John Donne's poem, Death Be Not Proud. That's a tough poem. But if we use those critical reading strategies, we can unlock a lot of its meaning.
All right, I'm game. Let's dive into Death Be Not Proud. What should we be looking for?
Well, first, let's think about the context. Donne was a poet and a priest in the 17th century, a time of a lot of religious and intellectual change. His poems often explore big ideas about life, death, and faith.
So we know right away that this poem isn't just some random thought about death. It's connected to Donne's own beliefs and experiences.
Exactly. Now let's look at the poem itself. Donne starts by using personification. He talks to death as if it's a person.
Oh, yeah. He says, Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. It's like he's having an argument with death.
Exactly. And by giving death human qualities like pride and arrogance, Donne is setting up this confrontation between the speaker and this powerful force.
And the speaker's tone is so defiant, like he's almost making fun of death. Why? What's he trying to do?
Donne is challenging the typical way we think about death. He's not just accepting it as this scary, inevitable end. He's using humor and irony to take away its power.
Okay, I'm starting to see it. But how do we know what Donne really thinks about death? Is he just playing devil's advocate?
That's where our knowledge of Donne's background comes in. We know he was very religious, so it's likely he is using his Christian beliefs to argue that death isn't the end, but a transition to eternal life.
That makes sense. He even calls death poor death later in the poem, almost like he feels sorry for it.
Right. Donne uses comparisons and metaphors to make death seem less important. He says death is just a short sleep that leads to an eternal waking.
And he even points out that things like poppy or charms can make you sleep just as well as death can. It's like he's saying death isn't even good at its one job.
He's taking away the fear and mystery around death, making it seem almost ordinary. It's a really clever way to argue his point.
Wow, I wouldn't have noticed any of that if I just skimmed the poem. It really shows how much you can miss if you don't read critically.
Exactly. There's so much more we could unpack in this poem, like the structure, the imagery, all the poetic techniques Donne uses. But let's save that for later.
All right, I'm hooked. Let's take a break and then we'll dive back into Death Be Not Proud and see what other secrets we can uncover.
Donne's Death Be Not Proud is like, it's like he's using language to kind of flip the script on what we're most afraid of.
Okay, I'm ready for more. Last time, we were talking about how Donne makes death seem less important by comparing it to sleep. But he also says death is like a slave to things like fate and chance.
Right. Yeah, he lists all these things that supposedly control death, like kings and desperate men, poison, war, sickness. It's like he's saying, hey, death, you're not even in charge here.
So by putting death in its place, he's actually making life and the human spirit seem even stronger. It's like a sneaky way of saying we have souls that live on forever without actually saying it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the way the poem is structured actually backs that up too. Did you notice how it's divided into these 4 sections, each one ending with a period?
Now that you mention it, yeah, I do. It's like those sections build on each other and lead up to this big finish.
Right. So the first section is all about challenging like death's fake power. Then in the second section, Donne switches gears and starts talking about death as something enjoyable. He compares it to rest and sleep, even saying it might be better than those things.
That's a weird idea. He's taking something we're usually afraid of and making it sound almost good.
I know, right? And then in the third section, he shows death's true nature, that it's really just a servant to fate and chance and all those other things. It's like he's pulling back the curtain and showing that death is actually weak.
Okay.
And then finally, in that fourth section, bam, he says death itself will die. That's like the ultimate comeback, right?
Yeah.
So Donne uses the structure of the poem to like mirror how his argument builds. He starts by challenging death, then he chips away at its power, and finally he claims victory over it.
It's amazing how much he packs into this short poem. And we haven't even talked about all those poetic devices he uses.
Oh yeah, Donne was a master of language. He uses things like alliteration and assonance, even the rhythm of the poem itself to make his argument stronger. But let's move on to another example of textual analysis. You also send over an analysis of Goldilocks and the Three Planets by Neil deGrasse Tyson, right?
Yeah, that one was really fun. It's not a traditional poem or anything, but Tyson's definitely got away with words. He uses this playful, almost childlike language to explain some pretty complex science stuff.
It's a great example of how we can use stories and analogies to make hard ideas easier to understand. He starts by comparing the habitable zone to the fairy tale of Goldilocks, who wanted everything just right.
I love that part. He explains that Venus is too hot, Mars is too cold, but Earth is just right. Just like Goldilocks' porridge and her bed. It's such a simple way to explain what a habitable zone is.
Exactly. But then he goes on to show that it's actually more complicated than that.
Hmm.
Like, Earth's average temperature should be below freezing if you only consider how much sunlight it reflects back into space.
Right, right. He brings up the greenhouse effect and how it's super important for keeping Earth warm enough for us to live here. And he even talks about how the sun used to be much dimmer billions of years ago.
Yeah.
So Earth should have been even colder back then.
Which leads to this really interesting question. How did Earth have liquid water and life way back then if it was so cold?
Yeah. Tyson doesn't have all the answers, but he throws out some ideas, like maybe the greenhouse effect was stronger back then, or maybe Earth was closer to the sun.
It just shows how science is always evolving. We're always finding out new things and changing our understanding of the universe.
And then Tyson takes us even further out, like way out into space, with this thing called the Drake equation. It's supposed to help us figure out how many other civilizations might be out there in the Milky Way galaxy.
That is some mind-blowing stuff. The Drake equation uses all sorts of factors, like how many stars there are, how many of those stars have planets, how many of those planets could support life, and so on.
It makes you wonder, right?
It really does. But Tyson points out that the Drake equation, like it was first thought up, might be too narrow, because it mostly focuses on those typical habitable zones.
Right.
He thinks we need to think about other things too, like something called tidal heating, which is the heat made by the gravity of planets and moons pulling on each other.
Okay.
He uses the example of Europa, one of Jupiter's moons.
Yeah.
It's thought to have a whole ocean of water under its icy surface.
Yeah. And even though Europa is way outside of what we usually think of as the habitable zone, all that heat from Jupiter's gravity could keep that ocean liquid and maybe even support life.
Exactly. And then he brings up these things called extremophiles, which are life forms that can survive in the craziest places, like super hot vents on the ocean floor.
Like, it blows my mind that anything could live in those places. It really makes you rethink what's possible.
It does. And it suggests that there might be way more life out there in the universe than we ever thought.
So maybe instead of just looking for planets that are the right distance from their stars, we should be looking for any place that could support some kind of life, no matter how extreme it seems.
Exactly. We got to broaden our definition of what habitable even means and be open to all sorts of possibilities. Who knows what incredible life forms are out there just waiting for us to find them?
Okay, so we've explored Donne's super clever use of language to make us less afraid of death, and Tyson's playful exploration of the cosmos and the potential for life beyond Earth. But what about some more practical stuff? You mentioned we also have some sources on using textual evidence in essays, right?
Oh, yeah. You sent some great tips on how to use quotes and other evidence from texts in your writing. One of the most important things is to make sure you're setting up every quote correctly.
Yeah, I remember learning about that in school. You can't just drop a quote in your essay without any explanation. It's like trying to fit a puzzle piece in without knowing where it goes.
Exactly. You got to give it context and show how that quote fits into your overall point. One of the sources even said to avoid clunky phrases like, "This quotation demonstrates that," or "the following lines show the reader that."
I know I've definitely used those phrases. What's a better way to introduce a quote?
Try to think about how you'd work it into a conversation naturally. Instead of saying, "This quote proves my point," you could say something like, "Donne's use of the word slave emphasizes how powerless death really is."
Oh, I see. It's about making the quote flow smoothly with your own words and analysis.
Exactly. And don't forget to choose your quotes carefully. Don't just use any random quote that kind of relates to your topic. Make sure it's actually adding something to your argument.
So it's about using quotes as tools to make your analysis stronger, not just to summarize what the text says. I think one of the YouTube videos you sent used an example of Mice and Men, right?
Right. It focused on this part where George is playing solitaire, by himself. The person in the video said that symbolizes how isolated and lonely George is.
Makes sense. Solitaire is a game you play alone.
Exactly. And the video really stressed the importance of giving context for that quote, like explaining that most of the other guys had left the bunkhouse, so it was just George and Lenny.
Right, right. That context helps us understand why George playing solitaire is so important. It's not just random. It shows how isolated he feels and how limited his relationship with Lenny is.
And they also pointed out that Lenny's not smart enough to play cards with George, which just makes George's loneliness even more obvious.
It's like all these little details add up to create a much deeper and richer understanding of what's going on.
Exactly. And that's what textual analysis is all about. It's about paying attention to those details, thinking about the context, and finding those insightful connections.
You also sent a really helpful tool called the Close Reading Interpretive Tool. What's that all about?
It's like a step-by-step guide for analyzing literature. It starts by having you paraphrase the passage, which basically means putting it in your own words.
I like that. Makes you think through it and make sure you really get what's going on before you start digging deeper.
Right. Then it has you observe the passage. This means noticing anything about the language or the form that might be important. It's where you start looking for patterns, themes, literary devices, anything that seems like it might mean something.
So you're like a detective looking for clues.
Exactly. Then you contextualize the passage. You think about the historical, cultural, or biographical stuff that might be relevant. This helps you understand the text in a bigger context.
So it's not just about the words on the page, it's about the world those words were written in.
Exactly. And then comes the really fun part, analyzing the passage. Here's where you explain how those things you noticed help you understand the text. You're connecting the dots, figuring things out, and developing your own interpretation.
Like you're building a case, using evidence from the text to back up your ideas.
Right. Then, of course, you got to argue for your interpretation. You got to present a clear argument that's backed up by evidence. This is where you bring it all together.
Like presenting your findings to a jury, trying to convince them that your interpretation makes sense.
Exactly. And last but not least, you reflect on your interpretation. Think about any questions you still have or anything about the passage that's still confusing.
That's important. It
Yeah.
shows that literary analysis is a process, that there's always more to discover.
Right, and it's about being open to different interpretations. There's no one right way to analyze a text.
It's more about asking good questions and having a real conversation with what you're reading.
Exactly, which brings us back to those critical reading strategies. Remember, it's not just about absorbing words. It's about actively engaging with the text, asking questions, making connections, and challenging your own assumptions.
It's about approaching reading with a growth mindset, believing that you can always learn and grow, even when the text is tough.
Exactly. And that mindset can help you with all sorts of things, not just reading, but learning new skills, solving problems, even navigating relationships.
It's about embracing the journey of learning and discovery.
Absolutely. The world is full of amazing information and ideas. It's up to us to engage with them, find the meaning, and grow our understanding.
Okay, so we've covered mindset, critical reading, textual analysis, and I feel like we're just getting started.
I know, right? We haven't even talked about the whole nature versus nurture thing.
Oh, yeah. That's a big one. And it ties in really well with everything we've been talking about.
For
All right, I'm definitely intrigued. Let's dive into that debate and see what we can learn. All right, so let's get into this nature versus nurture thing. It's like one of those big questions, right? Like how much of who we are comes from our genes and how much comes from our experiences.
Yeah, it's a question people have been thinking about forever, and it's not just some abstract philosophy thing. It really affects how we see ourselves and what we think we can do.
One of the videos you sent had Carol Dweck talking about this, and she had a really interesting take. She said, even if something's got a genetic component, it doesn't mean you can't change it.
Totally agree. Dweck's research shows that, our genes might give us a starting point, but it's our experiences, the effort we put in, and our mindset that really shape who we are.
It's like, it's like our genes are like a blueprint, but we're the architects who get to decide how to build the house, right?
Yeah, I like that.
We can make changes, additions, even completely renovate based on what we do.
That's a great way to put it. And it shows why it's so important to have a growth mindset, even for things that might seem like they're mostly determined by our genes.
So even if we're like predisposed to be good at something or to struggle with something, we can still influence how things turn out by working hard and believing that we can improve. It's pretty cool to think that we have so much control over our own lives.
Exactly. And that's why Dweck's research is so powerful. It challenges the idea that we're stuck with what we're born with and shows how much our mindset and our experiences can shape us.
It kind of reminds me of those students in Dweck's study who thought intelligence was fixed. They actually did worse over time, even though they probably started out with the same abilities as the kids who had a growth mindset.
Right. It's like they were holding themselves back because of what they believed.
Yeah.
They thought challenges as scary things instead of opportunities, and that stopped them from reaching their full potential.
So our mindset can actually make things happen or not happen just because we believe it will be that way.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think you're stuck, you'll act in ways that keep you stuck.
Right.
But if you think you can grow, you'll take on challenges and push yourself to get better.
It all comes back to that growth mindset, huh? It's not just about being positive or hopeful. It's about truly believing that you can get better at things through dedication and hard work.
You got it. And this goes way beyond just us as individuals, too. It affects how we approach things like relationships, education, even how we deal with big problems in society.
Yeah.
If we can create a culture where everyone has a growth mindset, we create a world where people feel like they can learn, take risks, and try to improve things.
It's pretty amazing to think about what that would be like.
Huh.
A world where everyone believes in their potential to grow and sees challenges as opportunities.
Right.
So how does all this connect to what we've been talking about? The critical reading, the textual analysis, those informational text structures. How does a growth mindset fit in with all that?
Well, think about those critical reading strategies we were talking about. A growth mindset makes us want to tackle tough reads with curiosity and a willingness to wrestle with difficult ideas.
Yeah.
It pushes us to ask questions, dig deeper, and keep going even when it's hard.
Instead of getting intimidated by like a dense academic article or some really challenging literature, we see it as a chance to get better at reading and learn something new.
Exactly. And when it comes to textual analysis, a growth mindset helps us look beyond the surface and really explore what the text means. We're not afraid to question the author, offer our own ideas, and really engage with what we're reading.
Right.
And even when we're dealing with those different ways information is organized in texts, a growth mindset helps us break down complicated stuff into smaller pieces and not give up until we understand how all those pieces fit together.
So basically, whether we're trying to read something difficult, analyze a complex text, or just learn something new, having a growth mindset can really help us succeed.
It's all about believing you can learn and improve, taking on challenges, and never losing that curiosity.
Well, I think this has been a fantastic deep dive. You've given us a lot to think about. We've covered everything from Carol Dweck's research on mindset to strategies for becoming better readers and writers.
We've looked at how to analyze texts, explored the universe and the possibility of life beyond Earth, even tackled the whole nature versus nurture debate.
And I think the biggest takeaway is that your mindset really matters. Believe in your ability to learn and grow, embrace challenges, and never stop exploring the world with curiosity and an open mind.
Learning is a journey that never ends, and there's always more to learn and discover.
We hope this deep dive has given you some new insights and inspired you to embrace the power of a growth mindset in your own life. Thanks for joining us.